before symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carner.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner, and today is May 17th, 2026. And tonight's episode is all about the oil trap. Why China cannot survive without the world. Now, China's rise into a global superpower is often presented as the story of unstoppable economic growth, technological advancement, and industrial dominance. Skyscrapers stretch endlessly across massive cities. Factories produce the goods consumed by much of the planet. And Beijing continues expanding its influence through trade, infrastructure, artificial intelligence, military modernization, and global investment. Now, to many observers, China appears positioned to become the defining power of the 21st century. But beneath the image of strength lies a dangerous structural weakness that shapes nearly every major decision the Chinese government makes. China cannot produce enough oil to sustain the machine that it built. And tonight's examination traces the hidden energy dependency beneath China's rise and explains why oil remains one of the most important forces shaping the modern world. Despite decades of technological advancement, the digital economy still depends on physical fuel. Factories require energy, cargo ships require diesel, militaries require jet fuel, data centers require electricity. Artificial intelligence infrastructure depends on industrial supply chains that still run on oil, mining, transportation, and global logistics. China became the manufacturing center of the world, but the larger its industrial system grew, the more dependent it became on imported energy flowing through the vulnerable maritime routes and geopolitical alliances outside its direct control. So this broadcast explores how China's energy insecurity explains many of the major tensions shaping global politics today. The audience will see why the South China Sea matters, why Taiwan sits at the center of global risk, why Beijing invested heavily in Belt and Road infrastructure, why China maintains close relationships with Russia and Iran, and why BRICS nations continue discussing alternatives to Western-controlled financial systems. The deeper issue is not simply competition between America and China. The deeper issue is that modern civilization itself has become trapped inside interconnected systems that require uninterrupted flows of energy, trade, technology, and finance to survive. This show also examines the uncomfortable reality that globalization created hidden vulnerabilities for every major nation involved. China depends heavily on imported oil and export markets. America depends heavily on foreign manufacturing and industrial supply chains. Both powers became deeply entangled inside the same system, even while increasingly competing for technological, military, and financial dominance. As geopolitical fragmentation grows, nations are now attempting to secure energy, supply chains, semiconductors, rare earth minerals, shipping routes, and industrial resilience before instability disrupts the structure beneath the global economy. The audience will walk away understanding that China's greatest vulnerability may not be military weakness, but dependence on uninterrupted energy flows through narrow global choke points that could become unstable during conflict. More importantly, this examination reveals a larger truth about the modern age itself. The digital future still depends on physical resources, industrial infrastructure, and the constant movement of fuel across the earth. The world may appear increasingly virtual, but the machine beneath the civilization still runs on oil. It's going to be interesting and a very long show. Shout out to everybody on the live chat Rumble. Number one warrior is Scorpion. Yeah, Scorpion on the live chat Rumble says, hey, Pastor and Warriors, it feels great to be back with y'all. Amen to that, brother. Thank you for being here, Scorpion. Number 2 warrior is Boots, the spark and spleefer Boots Halfman freak man, the wild cave guy, the dude in the shelter smoking a peace pipe. Boots Hafner says, hello, James and Warrior family. Glad to see y'all here, and let's all hit that thumbs up button. Yes. And don't forget to tell a friend about James's very own award-winning detox formula, ElitePotion.com. Thank you, Boots, for reminding me. Yeah, ElitePotion.com. We're changing the whole look and feel of it. We're getting rid of the old 20s style, and we're going to go just towards non-conspiracy, removing metals and parasites, and we'll see where that goes, because my marketing efforts was only marketing to conspiracy people, and well, that's what I thought I was originally marketing to, but well, regardless, we're going to try something new, something different, something we're basically going to just see where it goes. But thank you, Boots. And yeah, if you could all do me a favor, likes are very important. If you really do like the show, I need you to follow my thumb right now with me. Take your thumb, go down to the X on your phone, just like I'm doing. Hit the thumbs up, and then hit live chat, and you won't lose your place, I promise. Thank you, Boots, for the shout out. Number 3 warriors, Robert Gertison saying, hi, y'all. Hi, James. Let's talk about China. We might learn a lot about our nation. Absolutely. Then Robert Gertison says hi to Boots, and Boots says hi to Scorpion and Robert Gertison. Guys, thank you so much for being here. We're going to get straight into a commercial because breaking news, we just don't have time for it. So stick around.
We are being lied to about our sovereignty, about our health, about birth, and about what's actually best for our families. And most women don't even realize it until they're already in the system. Hi, my name is Lisa, the Sovereign Woman. I'm going live every single day for 31 days at 8 p.m. Eastern, Monday through Friday on YouTube and TikTok. This is for the woman who knows there has to be another way. A way to give birth without fear, without being controlled, without giving up her authority. Inside these lives, I'm teaching you how to surrender to God, trust your body, and step into a truly sovereign and fearless birth. Not from hype, not from rebellion, but from truth. So if you feel that pull, like something isn't right, like you were made for more than what you've been told, come join me. I'll see you live.
Hey, George, why is the IRS taking so much of my money? Why would you bring that binding contract onto my vessel? I thought we were all in the same boat and pay our taxes. You mean taxation without representation? You should have never worn a red coat on this ship with those ridiculous forms. You don't even live in D.C.
I've been rolling in my grave since 1913. Why are you binding yourself to a contract to Washington, D.C. that has no bearing on you? For this reason, we set the 13 colonies free from this type of tax. Do you know what this document is? It protects you from a direct tax from the national government. Which of these would you rather live by? What about you? Do you also sign binding contracts every April 15th? Click the link below and regain your freedom.
All right, guys, we're back. So, welcome to Cause Before Symptom, where we do not chase headlines. We do not chase personalities or even emotional reactions. We trace the structures beneath the visible world and examine the systems that shape nations, economies, wars, and civilizations themselves. Now, for years, the public has been told that the future would be digital, clean energy, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, automation, smart cities, electric vehicles, a world supposedly moving beyond oil, beyond industrial dependency, beyond the physical struggles that shaped the 20th century. But the deeper we examine the modern world, the more we discover something that changes the entire conversation. The digital world still runs on physical fuel. Artificial intelligence requires data centers. Data centers require electricity. Electricity requires infrastructure. Infrastructure requires mining, transportation, steel, copper, rare earth minerals, and industrial manufacturing. Cargo ships still move goods across oceans. Militaries still consume enormous amounts of fuel. Agriculture still depends on petroleum products. Semiconductor factories require vast industrial systems simply to function. So the cloud itself is built on physical machines sitting inside energy-hungry facilities spreading all across the earth. And nowhere in this contradiction is more visible than China. China became the factory of the world. In only a few decades, it transformed from widespread poverty into the largest industrial machine modern civilization has ever witnessed. Entire cities appeared almost overnight. High-speed rail systems stretched across thousands of miles. Ports expanded into giant logistical hubs connecting east and west. Hundreds of millions of people entered industrial society within a single generation. And the world outsourced manufacturing to China because it was efficient, cheap, fast, and relentless. But beneath this rise was a hidden weakness. China built a machine larger than the fuel beneath its own soil. Well, that changes everything. A nation that cannot fully power itself becomes dependent on systems outside its direct control. Oil tankers become lifelines. Shipping lanes become matters of national survival. Maritime choke points become military priorities. Foreign ports become strategic assets. Trade agreements become energy insurance policies. Financial systems become geopolitical weapons. And suddenly, economics, military expansion, infrastructure projects, diplomacy, and technology, they all merge into one larger struggle over continuity itself. This is why the South China Sea matters. This is why Taiwan matters. This is why China invested heavily in Africa, the Middle East, Russia, and the Belt and Road Initiative. This is why Beijing fears sanctions and financial isolation. And this is why the modern world is entering an age where supply chains, semiconductors, shipping routes, rare earth materials and minerals, and energy infrastructure are becoming more important than slogans and speeches. Because beneath all the politics is a much deeper truth. Modern civilization was built on the assumption that global systems would remain uninterrupted forever. Well, they were supposed to be that way. And that assumption may no longer be safe. Well, tonight we're going to examine the oil trap beneath China's rise. We're going to trace how dependency shapes foreign policy, military expansion, global alliances, and economic strategy. We're going to explore why the world's largest manufacturing power fears interruption above almost everything else. And we are going to examine what happens when modern nations discover that the systems which made them powerful also made them vulnerable. Because history shows us something very important. Empires rarely collapse simply because they lose battles. They collapse when they can no longer sustain the system that feeds them. Well, this is how China became the factory of the world. Now, to understand why China needs more oil than it can produce, China actually produces its own oil. And yes, they can produce oil from the South China Sea as well. They have their own oil production facilities in-house. And to understand why China needs more oil than it can produce, well, the story cannot begin with oil itself. It begins with transportation and transformation. And transportation too, but one of the greatest economic transformations in recorded history. Only a few generations ago, not long, China was still largely rural, poor, internally fractured, and economically isolated from much of the global system. Large portions of the population lived agrarian lifestyles. Industrial output was limited compared to Western powers. Infrastructure was underdeveloped. Transportation systems were weak. The country endured revolutions, political campaigns, famine, ideological upheaval, and long periods of instability that slowed modernization for decades. But during the late 20th century, something changed. Could have been helped with the Bush family. China began operating portions of its economy to market reforms and industrial development. Manufacturing zones expanded rapidly. Foreign corporations searching for lower labor costs moved production into Chinese territory. Western consumers wanted cheaper products. Well, I didn't. Investors wanted larger profit margins. Politicians believed globalization would create long-term stability and economic interdependence between nations. Well, the result was a historic migration of industrial production toward China. Factories multiplied across the country at astonishing speed, and cities that once held modest populations exploded into megacities filled with construction cranes, industrial parks, highways, ports, and apartment towers. Entire regions were reorganized around export manufacturing. Electronics, textiles, machinery, steel, chemicals, plastics, automotive parts, consumer products, and eventually advanced technology systems all began flowing out of these Chinese factories toward the rest of the world. Well, the scale of this transformation is difficult for most people to fully grasp. Hundreds of millions of people moved from rural life into industrialized urban environments within a relatively short historical window. China poured concrete at levels never seen before in human history and civilization. Massive transportation systems emerged. High-speed rail networks stretched across the nation. And shipping ports expanded into giant logistical arteries connecting Asia to Europe and eventually North America. The global economy itself reorganized around Chinese manufacturing. Yeah. And consumers in the West benefited from lower prices with cheap goods. Shit that falls apart within a year. It's like buying a lawnmower. You have to buy one every 2 years because they just fall apart. Well, consumers in the West benefited from lower prices, and corporations benefited from cheaper labor and large-scale production capacity. China benefited from industrial growth, rising exports, technological acquisition, and massive economic expansion. And the arrangement appeared mutually beneficial for decades. But beneath this rise was a hidden structure reality that became more dangerous than the larger China's economy grew. Industrial civilization consumes enormous amounts of energy. Factories require electricity all around the clock, 24/7, bam, 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 bam. Steel production requires heat and fuel. Transportation systems require diesel and gasoline. Cargo fleets require petroleum products. Construction equipment runs on fuel. Aviation requires jet fuel. Petrochemical industrials require hydrocarbons. And even food systems depend heavily on industrial logistics powered by energy. Well, China did possess significant coal reserves, and coal became one of the central foundations of its electrical generation. Massive coal consumption powered much of China's industrial rise. But coal alone could not sustain every aspect of a rapidly modernized economy, integrated deeply into global trade networks. Now, I looked at China through Google Earth, and dude, I've never seen so many solar panels and windmills in my entire life. It's just flooded throughout that country. And oil demand surged as industrialization accelerated. As personal vehicle ownership expanded, transportation needs increased dramatically. And as exports grew, shipping requirements expanded. As military modernization accelerated, fuel consumption increased further. As aviation networks expanded and urbanization intensified, the demand curve continued climbing. And eventually, China crossed a critical threshold. Its industrial appetite outpaced its domestic oil production capacity. Well, it transformed China from a nation with manageable internal energy systems into one of the world's largest importers of crude oil. Importers. And that moment changed the trajectory of Chinese strategy forever. Once a nation becomes dependent on imported energy, geography suddenly matters more. Shipping routes matter more. Naval power matters more. Foreign alliances matter more. Maritime choke points matter more, and political stability in distant regions suddenly affect domestic survival. Well, the larger China's industrial machine became, the more vulnerable it became to interruption. And this is one of the great paradoxes of modern power. Growth creates strength, but growth also creates dependency. The same factories that generated wealth required imported resources. The same export systems that lifted China into global influence tied the nation to shipping networks beyond its direct control. Well, the same industrial success that made China powerful also trapped it inside a system that must continuously feed itself to remain stable. Well, this is where oil stops being merely an economic issue. Oil becomes national survival. And once survival becomes tied to uninterrupted global energy flows, even by 10%, every foreign policy decision begins to change around that reality. And this is the hidden weakness beneath China's power. When most people think about China, they picture strength, massive cities glowing with lights, endless factories producing the world's goods, bullet trains crossing the country at incredible speeds, advanced technology companies, expanding military capabilities, artificial intelligence ambitions, even surveillance systems and gigantic infrastructure projects. Basically, a civilization rising into superpower status before the eyes of the world. And yes, catch nets for people jumping out of windows for killing themselves from working too hard, building shit products. But large systems often hide fragile foundations beneath visible strength. The modern Chinese economy depends on something it cannot fully control: uninterrupted access to foreign energy, oil. Uninterrupted. And that single reality sits beneath many of the tensions shaping global politics today. China imports enormous quantities of crude oil every single day. A significant portion of its oil travels from the Middle East, Africa, and other energy-producing regions through maritime routes stretching thousands of miles across vulnerable waters. Tankers carrying fuel toward China must pass through strategic choke points that could become unstable during conflict, sanctions, piracy, geopolitical escalation, or military blockade. Well, one of the most important of these choke points is the Strait of Malacca. Have you guys heard of this? I didn't. Most people rarely think about this narrow waterway between Malaysia and Indonesia. Yet it carries a tremendous portion of global trade and energy shipments. Now, for China, it represents one of the most vulnerable arteries feeding the industrial machine that powers the nation. Chinese strategists have worried about this vulnerability for years. The concern is simple. If hostile powers disrupted access through these routes during a crisis, China could face severe economic and industrial consequences. Oil imports could slow dramatically, shipping insurance costs could skyrocket, supply chains could destabilize, industrial production could weaken, transportation networks could suffer disruption, economic confidence could collapse. Well, this fear became so significant that analysts eventually gave it a name: the Malacca Dilemma. Well, the deeper issue is not merely military vulnerability, it is systemic vulnerability. Modern industrial economies depend on continuity, right? You made a deal, ship your stuff here, or we'll bring it here ourselves on time. Well, factories cannot simply shut down for extended periods without consequences. Ports cannot freeze indefinitely. Massive urban populations depend on transportation, electricity, food logistics, and industrial activity operating continuously. Large economies become increasingly fragile when their systems depend on uninterrupted flow. Well, China's rise created exactly this kind of dependency structure. And the country became so successful at manufacturing that it locked itself into a permanent requirement for massive energy imports. Catch-22. The machine must continue feeding itself every single day. Oil tankers must continue arriving. Shipping routes must remain open. And trade systems must remain functional. Well, this creates a very different picture of power than most people imagine. China is not simply expanding outward because it desires influence or influence's sake alone. Much of its behavior reflects the actions of a nation trying to secure the arteries that keep its industrial civilization alive. This is why energy security became central to Chinese strategic planning. It explains why Beijing invested heavily in naval modernization. It explains why China expanded relationships with energy-producing nations, like Venezuela, till we took it. It explains why overseas infrastructure projects became so important. It explains why Beijing fears sanctions and financial isolation. It explains why Chinese leadership watches maritime stability so closely. You see, dependency changes national behavior. And the larger the system becomes, the more terrified leadership becomes of interruption. So this is not unique to China. Every major industrial civilization eventually becomes dependent on complex systems it cannot fully control. But China's situation is particularly intense because its industrial growth happens so quickly and at such a massive scale. Hundreds of millions of people were integrated into a high-energy industrial economy within only a few short decades. Well, that level of expansion requires astonishing resource consumption. The public often hears discussions about China's manufacturing power, but rarely hears enough about what feeds that power. Every skyscraper, cargo ship, semiconductor facility, industrial park, and export network rests upon energy flowing continuously through global systems that stretch far beyond Chinese borders. Well, this creates a paradox, folks. The stronger China becomes economically, the more vulnerable it became strategically. Because once a nation depends on external systems for survival, those systems become potential pressure points during conflict, which is what we have right now in Iran. And this is one reason why China has become increasingly focused on redundancy. It's having backups. Beijing understands that dependence on a small number of vulnerable maritime routes creates long-term risk. The country has spent years trying to diversify pipelines, strengthen infrastructure, secure foreign ports, expand domestic reserves, and build strategic partnerships capable of reducing the danger of interruption. Well, China's leaders understand something many ordinary people do not fully realize. Modern civilization is not held together merely by ideology or just politics alone. It's held together by flow of energy, goods, shipping, flow of finance, technology, and industrial production. Well, interrupt the flow long enough, which is what Iran's war is doing, and even powerful nations begin to shake. And this is the hidden weakness beneath China's rise. Now, I know the news media is all yelling that Trump's making a big mistake with Iran, but I don't think so. I think he's interrupting their oil supply on purpose because once their factories stop, the factories go out of business. The factories go out of business. They have to play catch up. It's not good for China. It's a hidden weakness. It's not for a lack of intelligence. They saw it coming. Not for a lack of manufacturing. They had plenty. Not even for a lack of ambition. But unfortunately, they painted themselves into a corner and became dependent. And once dependency becomes the foundation beneath the civilization scale machine, the fear of disruption begins shaping everything above it. This is why the South China Sea matters. You see, to most people, the South China Sea appears like another distant geopolitical dispute filled with maps, islands, military patrols, and political arguments between governments. Remember, they built a bunch of islands outside of their country in the Pacific. Boop, 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 boop. What in the hell are they doing? Well, the headlines usually framed it as, well, it's nationalism and territorial conflict or regional rivalry. But beneath the political language is something far more important to understand. The South China Sea is one of the most critical energy and trade arteries on Earth. Trillions of dollars in global commerce, trillions, move through these waters every year. Massive volumes of oil and natural gas shipments pass through shipping lanes connected to the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Container ships carrying electronics, machinery, industrial materials, food products, and consumer goods travel through the region continuously. Some of the most important maritime trade routes in the modern world converge right there. Now, for China, these waters are not simply strategic, they're existential. The modern Chinese economy depends heavily on imported resources arriving safely by sea. Oil tankers must continue moving. Export cargo must continue flowing outward. Raw materials must continue entering the country. The larger China's industrial system became, the more vulnerable these maritime pathways became to disruption. And this is why Beijing became intensely focused on controlling or influencing the surrounding waters. Over the past several decades, China accelerated naval modernization at extraordinary speed. Remember, they've got, 2 aircraft carriers and a bunch of destroyers now that just pop, 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 pop. Well, the country expanded its submarine fleet, developed anti-ship missile systems, built aircraft carriers, strengthened maritime surveillance capabilities, and constructed military infrastructure across disputed islands and reefs through the South China Sea. Now, to outside observers, these actions often actually appear aggressive or expansionist. Like, nobody could take the sea. Nobody could take inside there. Nobody owns the sea. But they basically took over that little area. And for many neighboring nations, perspectives, well, they absolutely are. But from China's strategic viewpoint, the issue looks different. Chinese planners see dependence on vulnerable sea lanes as a long-term national security threat. They fear a future where hostile powers could restrict maritime access during conflict. They fear blockade scenarios. They fear energy interruption. They fear industrial paralysis. And the deeper the dependence, the greater the fear, which they rightfully had, because look at what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz. This helps explain why Beijing reacted so strongly to increasing military cooperation between the United States and regional allies in the Indo-Pacific. China understands that American naval power still dominates much of the global maritime system. U.S. military alliances stretch across Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and other strategic locations throughout the Pacific region. We did that on purpose so we can get a bigger cut, because we're not a very good country. Not to our neighbors or our own people. But from Washington's perspective, these alliances help maintain regional stability and freedom of navigation, of course. From Beijing's perspective, they can also appear like a containment structure surrounding vulnerable energy arteries, which is really what it is. And this is where the South China Sea becomes more than a regional dispute. It becomes a pressure point between competing systems of power. China's island building campaigns illustrate this very clear. Over time, Beijing transformed reefs and disputed territories into fortified artificial islands containing airstrips, radar systems, missile defenses, ports, and military facilities. Critics argued that China was militarizing international waters, while China argued it was protecting territorial sovereignty and regional security. I would have to agree with them on that, because America wasn't playing by the rules, they wrote the rules. But underneath both narratives lies the same reality. China wants greater control over the maritime routes, feeding its industrial machine. And the reason this matters globally is because modern civilization itself depends on these shipping corridors to remain stable. Well, the average person really thinks about how fragile global trade systems actually are. Grocery stores, electronics markets, pharmaceutical supplies, industrial components, automobiles, medical equipment, and consumer goods all depend on enormous logistical systems operating continuously across oceans. Logistical systems are just servers and software that track shipments going back and forth and all the data related to it. Well, shipping delays alone can trigger inflation, shortages, and even economic instability. So major maritime conflict could create consequences far beyond military confrontation itself. Now, the world witnessed smaller glimpses of this fragility during supply chain disruptions in recent years, like through COVID. Ports backed up, shipping costs surged, shortages appeared, manufacturing slowed, even temporary disruptions exposed how interconnected the global economy had become. Now imagine those vulnerabilities during major geopolitical escalation involving one of the world's largest industrial powers. Well, that's why the South China Sea matters so much, because it's not simply about territory or politics or even nationalism. Because the region sits directly beneath the arteries feeding the modern global economy. And China understands this. The United States understand this. The regional powers understand this. And increasingly, the struggle is not merely over military dominance alone. It's over continuity itself, which nations can secure the trade routes, energy systems, and industrial infrastructure required to sustain modern civilization during periods of instability? Well, this is why maritime power is returning to the center of global strategy after decades where many assumed globalization had a major resource or has made major resource struggles obsolete. Well, the digital age did not erase geography. It made geography more important again because ports matter. Shipping lanes matter, choke points matter, and energy corridors matter. And the South China Sea sits directly in the middle of one of the most important flows on Earth. And that is why tensions there continue rising for decades as well. Since they started building it, we started surrounding our ships around it, just looking at them. We didn't stop them. Because when nations become dependent on uninterrupted flow, control over the routes themselves become a matter of survival. And China wanted to survive. And this is where Taiwan and the semiconductor lifeline begins to take fold. Most people are told that Taiwan is simply a political dispute between China and a breakaway island government. Others frame it entirely as a democracy versus authoritarianism conflict. While politics and ideology absolutely matter, those explanations alone are incomplete. Taiwan sits at the center of several systems so important to modern civilizations that even a limited conflict, small one, limited, it could send shockwaves through the global economy almost overnight. So Taiwan is not just territory, it's infrastructure, geography, it's technology. And increasingly, it is one of the most dangerous pressure points in modern world. So to understand why Taiwan matters so much, it is important to understand semiconductors, computer chips. Modern civilization depends on chips in ways most people rarely think about. This is important to understand and learn. Smartphones, vehicles, military systems, satellites, banking infrastructure, AI systems, telecommunications, medical equipment, power grids, industrial machinery, and data centers, just to name a few, all rely on advanced semiconductors. The digital economy itself rests upon tiny pieces of engineered silicon manufactured through astonishingly complex industrial processes. Very few companies on Earth possess the ability to produce the most advanced chips at scale, with assembly lines. Very few. Taiwan became one of the most critical centers of this production system. And that reality transformed the island into something far larger than a regional political issue. Taiwan now sits near the center of global technological continuity. This means a major disruption involving Taiwan would not simply affect East Asia. It could impact nearly every advanced economy on Earth. This is why nobody's attacked it yet, either America or China. Automobile manufacturing could slow, AI development could stall, electronics industries could face shortages, military procurement systems could suffer delays, technology companies could experience massive supply disruptions, and they're feeling it right now, actually. And the financial market could react violently. A crash. So global shipping costs could also surge, and insurance rates across maritime trade, well, they could rise sharply. Well, the modern economy is far more interconnected than most people realize, and Taiwan sits near one of its most sensitive pressure points. But semiconductors are only part of the story. Taiwan also occupies an enormously strategic geographic position near critical shipping routes throughout East Asia. Maritime traffic moving through surrounding waters supports global trade systems that connect Asia to the rest of the world. Now, for China, Taiwan's location matters not only politically, but militarily and economically as well. Chinese leadership fears encirclement. That's what we've been doing. And Beijing understands that foreign military alliances positioned near critical maritime routes create strategic vulnerability. From China's perspective, Taiwan represents both unfinished historical business and a potential obstacle sitting near some of the most important arteries feeding Chinese industrial systems. So this is one of the reasons that tensions surrounding Taiwan continue escalating, because the issue is no longer isolated to ideology or nationalism alone. As Taiwan now intersects with energy security, semiconductor production, naval strategy, global trade, and technological competition all at the same time. And this is what makes the situation so dangerous. The United States views Taiwan as strategically important for maintaining balance in the Indo-Pacific region. American policymakers also understand how critical semiconductor stability is for both economic and military systems. U.S. alliances throughout the Pacific reinforce this strategic framework. So China views Taiwan as central to national sovereignty and regional security. Beijing also understands that foreign military influence near vulnerable maritime routes increases long-term strategic risk. Both sides increasingly view Taiwan through the lens of national security. Well, that creates a dangerous cycle. And as tensions rise, military preparations increase. As military preparations increase, distrust deepens. Didn't Hegseth just mention we need $1.5 trillion now? $1.5 trillion. They raised it 1.5. As distrust deepens, economic decoupling accelerates and supply chains begin shifting. Nations start building redundancies. Semiconductor manufacturing gets treated as strategic infrastructure rather than simple commerce. But hey, don't worry about all this. Aliens. See what I mean? This is the real stuff here. And the world is quietly entering a new era where technological infrastructure is becoming inseparable from geopolitical power. So this is one of the biggest changes happening beneath the surface of modern civilization. And for decades, many people assumed globalization would reduce conflict by making nations economically dependent on one another. Isn't that what the UN promised? We want a new world order, get everybody all working together. And to some extent, it did, sort of. Gave the rich and powerful more money. And the global economy became deeply interconnected, but interdependence, well, that created new vulnerabilities. Once critical systems became concentrated in certain regions, those regions became strategic pressure points during instability. And Taiwan is one of the clearest examples of this reality. A small island became essential to the functioning of a digital world. How did that happen? And because modern civilization depends so heavily on semiconductors, the stakes surrounding Taiwan continue rising. So the deeper the issue, it's not simply whether China and America disagree politically. The deeper issue is that the modern world concentrated too much on critical infrastructure into fragile global systems vulnerable to disruption. Semiconductors became centralized. Manufacturing became centralized. Shipping, energy routes. And efficiency created dependency. And dependency created vulnerability. And this is why Taiwan matters far beyond East Asia, because it reveals how fragile the architecture of the modern world truly is beneath the appearance of technological advancement and global connectivity. Now, to simply say that Satan's in control of all this, and he's doing that on purpose, that doesn't make any sense. He may be playing around with both sides, but he doesn't have full control over the world leaders and their decisions and choices. Otherwise, Satan would have his new world order, right? So the world built an economy dependent on uninterrupted flow, and Taiwan now sits directly in the middle of those flows. Thus, the Belt and Road Initiative, where the infrastructure is needed to be built for survival for China. When China announced the Belt and Road Initiative, Silk Road 2.0, many people viewed it as little more than an enormous infrastructure project designed to expand trade and economic influence. Railways, highways, ports, pipelines, bridges, industrial parks, shipping hubs, and energy corridors began appearing across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and portions of Europe. Governments signed agreements, Chinese investment flowed outward, construction projects expanded across multiple continents at staggering scale. Well, supporters described Belt and Road as economic cooperation and global development. Critics described it as a debt trap diplomacy designed to expand Chinese control. But beneath both arguments lies even a deeper strategic reality. China was not simply building infrastructure. China was building redundancy, to keep the manufacturing going. And to understand why this matters, it is important to return to the central problem facing modern China: dependency on vulnerable global energy and trade routes. Chinese leadership understands that a nation dependent on a small number of maritime choke points becomes exposed to interruption. And if shipping lanes become unstable during war, sanctions, piracy, or even geopolitical escalation, well, the entire industrial machine becomes vulnerable. So the Belt and Road Initiative can be viewed as an attempt to reduce that vulnerability. Because they could see that eventually, when Saudi Arabia's contract is up with America, that we may take Venezuela, and they've had control over Venezuela for a long time. So pipelines reduced reliance on maritime shipping alone. Rail systems create alternative trade corridors. Overseas ports establish logistical footholds outside Chinese territory. And infrastructure investments strengthen relationships with resource-producing nations. Industrial projects create long-term influence across strategic regions connected to global trade. So the deeper China examined its own weaknesses, the more Beijing realized it needed multiple pathways feeding the machine. This is why China investment expanded aggressively into ports throughout the Indian Ocean, Africa, the Middle East, and portions of Europe and South America. Control does not always require military conquest. Sometimes influence grows through infrastructure ownership, financial agreements, shipping contracts, and long-term logistical integration, like China's been doing with blue states and their ports. Ports become strategic assets. Railways become strategic assets. Pipelines, the same. Energy corridors, strategic. Because in the modern world, infrastructure itself increasingly functions as power. And when we invaded Venezuela, Chinese stockpiled 100 days of oil since January. They've been stockpiling like crazy, and they have 100 days left. One of the most important aspects of the Belt and Road Initiative is that it reflects a shift in how nations think about survival. During earlier eras, military expansion alone often defined geopolitical influence. Today, logistical continuity may matter just as much as armies themselves. A nation capable of securing trade routes, maintaining supply chains, protecting energy access, and sustaining industrial production gains enormous strategic advantages. China understood this early, and the country recognized that globalization created opportunities, but also big dangers. The same interconnected trade systems that allowed China to rise could also become tools of pressure during instability, which is happening right now. And Beijing watched how sanctions affected other nations. Chinese planners observed how financial restrictions, shipping disruptions, and resource shortages could weaken governments without traditional warfare. So this reinforced China's desire to build parallel systems capable of reducing dependency on vulnerable Western-controlled networks. So that does not mean the Belt and Road guarantees safety, as many projects faced criticism, financial problems, political resistance, corruption allegations, and economic uncertainty, and we invaded Iran because of it. And some countries accumulated heavy debt burdens connected to Chinese infrastructure financing, like Venezuela. And some projects struggled economically. Others generated fears about long-term political influence. But even with these problems, the larger strategic logic remains visible. China is attempting to create multiple arteries feeding its industrial civilization. And the need for these arteries becomes more understandable once the scale of Chinese energy dependency is fully grasped. The Chinese economy cannot simply pause for several months without consequences. Factories employ enormous populations, and export systems support massive economic activity. Urban centers depend on constant logistical coordination. So stability itself depends on continuity, and the larger the industrial machine grows, the more dangerous interruption becomes. Remember, they have their own stock market. They have their own yuan that they rely on. It cannot crash. Well, this creates a strong paradox within globalization itself. The world became deeply interconnected because interconnected systems generated enormous economic growth. But the more interconnected the world became, the more vulnerable major nations became to disruption within those same systems. And China is now attempting to solve that problem through infrastructure expansion. Belt and Road is not merely about influence abroad, it's about reducing the fear of isolation at home. And this helps explain why Chinese foreign policy often focuses heavily on practical infrastructure rather than ideological one alone. So ports matter because trade matters. Pipelines matter because energy matters. Railroads matter because continuity matters. And logistics, computers, servers, software programs to keep track of all this crap, it matters because industrial civilization cannot survive without flow. And this is why the Belt and Road Initiative became so massive, because China understands something many nations are rediscovering at the same time. Modern power does not depend only on military strength anymore. Modern power depends on who can keep systems functioning during instability. Well, who can move fuel? Who can move goods or technology? Who can maintain industrial continuity when global conditions deteriorate? Well, that's the real purpose between the roads, ports, pipelines, and railways stretching from China across the modern world. And the machine must continue feeding itself. And the Belt and Road Initiative became one of Beijing's largest attempts to make sure it can. And this is why China works with Russia and Iran. Because one of the most misunderstood aspects of modern geopolitics is the assumption that nations operate primarily on friendship, ideology, or moral alignment. No, not China. In reality, large powers often cooperate because of overlapping strategic needs rather than genuine trust. This is especially true when energy security becomes tied to national survival. Just like when Iran started blowing up other countries with missiles, even though they're on U.S. bases, China wasn't happy about that. What are you doing? So China's relationships with Russia and Iran make far more sense once viewed through the lens of energy dependency. And Russia possesses enormous reserves of oil, natural gas, minerals, and raw materials. They're fine. Iran sits near some of the most important energy corridors on Earth and controls access near the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical oil choke points. And both countries hold strategic value to China, not simply because they oppose portions of Western influence, but because they help reduce Beijing's vulnerability to interruption. So China needs energy continuity. And nations rich in energy resources naturally become important partners. But this does not mean China fully trusts Russia or Iran in every area. History shows that major powers rarely operate through permanent loyalty. As you can see, when we invaded Iran, Iran asked for help from Russia and China. Russia and China said, we're just business partners. We never said we were, like NATO. So alliances shift, interests evolve, competition continues even between cooperating nations. But states often work together when the strategic benefit outweighs the risk. Now, for Beijing, securing long-term access to oil and gas matters more than ideological purity. And this is why pipeline agreements with Russia became increasingly important over time. Remember, China and Russia, these border each other. Land-based energy routes provide China with something maritime imports alone cannot guarantee: partial insulation from naval disruption. Oil and natural gas flowing over land reduce dependence on vulnerable shipping lanes controlled by global maritime systems. Thus, pipelines become strategic insurance. China understands that if conflict ever disrupted major sea routes, overland energy access could become critically important for maintaining industrial continuity, meaning if Russia can give them as much oil as they can, pump, 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 drill, baby, drill. Well, this helps explain why China and Russia cooperation intensified in areas involving energy infrastructure, trade agreements, financial systems, and long-term resource access. Western sanctions against Russia accelerated portions of this relationship even further. As Russia forced restrictions from Western markets and banking systems, China gained opportunities to secure discounted energy supplies while both nations expanded discussions around alternative trade mechanisms outside traditional Western financial control, which means oil embargo. Now, energy security and financial security began merging together into one larger strategic conversation. Iran represents another important piece of this structure, as Iran holds some of the largest oil and natural gas reserves in the world. It also occupies a strategically critical geographic position near major maritime energy corridors. For China, maintaining relationships with Iran helps diversify supply options while strengthening influence across regions essential to global energy flow. Well, this is one of the major reasons why Beijing often approaches Middle Eastern diplomacy very differently than the Western powers. China's primary focus is usually stability and resource continuity, not going to war with America or starting World War III. Political ideology matters less than uninterrupted access to energy systems, and this reveals something deeper about the modern world. Many geopolitical conflicts that appear ideological on the surface are also resource security struggles underneath. Energy access shapes foreign policy for more than most ordinary people realize. Far more. Nations dependent on imported fuel became deeply sensitive to instability in resource-producing regions. And shipping routes, sanction regimes, pipeline infrastructure, and regional conflicts suddenly became domestic economic concerns. Well, this is especially true for China because of the sheer scale of its industrial machine. China consumes extraordinary amounts of energy to sustain manufacturing, transportation, exports, construction, data infrastructure, and urban life across massive population centers. A prolonged energy shock would simply create inconvenience. Would not simply create inconvenience, it could threaten economic stability itself. When we took out Venezuela, we stopped flow to China. When we took out and blockaded Hormuz and started bombing Iran, it blocked oil to China. How much? What's the percentage? Tough to say, because we don't know how much oil that they're getting via embargo, meaning black market oil through Russia. Even though Russia's under sanctions, they're not supposed to give oil to China. But even Russia and the oil that they're getting from Saudi Arabia, it's still not enough. And economic stability is directly tied to political stability. And this is one of the reasons Chinese leadership fears sanctions and containment strategies so strongly. Beijing watched carefully as financial restrictions and economic pressure campaigns affected nations like Russia and Iran. Chinese planners understand that dependence on external systems creates leverage for rival powers. And you guys, I don't think you understand, but Trump has way more cards to play against China. It's not just cutting off their oil. He could sanction them, raise tariffs on them. There's more things he could do. Say, man, we're just not going to work with you anymore. Goodbye. That would hurt their economy bad. So that realization accelerated China's effort to diversify trade relationships, which is why they accepted Trump and all of the CEOs from major tech companies to come hang out with China and try to figure this thing out. It accelerated China's effort to diversify trade relationships, to build alternative payment mechanisms, to increase gold reserves and expand the yuan-based trade agreements, and strengthen partnerships outside traditional Western influence structures. And the deeper issue is not simply anti-American alignment, it's actual vulnerability reduction. China fears becoming trapped inside systems controlled by geopolitical rivals, and this fear shapes much of Beijing's long-term strategy. At the same time, there are risks within these partnerships as well, as Russia faces demographic, economic, and military pressures of its own. Iran faces a regional instability and sanction pressure. Energy alliances themselves can become fragile during changing political conditions. So China cannot fully eliminate its vulnerability simply by building partnerships. But Beijing is clearly attempting to create a world where its survival cannot be interrupted by a single external pressure point. And that's a larger pattern emerging here. Pipelines, energy corridors, alternative banking systems, BRICS expansion, port investments, long-term resources and contracts, currency diversification, infrastructure diplomacy, more and more and more. Well, these aren't isolated policies. They're pieces of a broader strategy designed to reduce dependency on systems China does not fully control. Because the sorry, I lost my place. Yeah, so Beijing is clearly attempting to create a world where its survival cannot be interrupted by a single external pressure point. And because the larger the industrial machine grows, China, the more dangerous dependency becomes, obviously. In China, they understand that modern wars may not always begin with bombs alone. Sometimes they begin with sanctions. We're under a modern war. It's an economic war, information war. It includes computer attacks, viruses, etc., hacking. They're doing it to us, we're doing it to them, back and forth. And sometimes they begin with sanctions and supply chain disruptions, blocked shipping routes, frozen financial access, and interrupted flow. We're nailing them more and more and more. And we know, America does, that China is completely dependent on all oil. And if we choke them off even a few places, It's not good for China. And that's why the relationship through energy matters so much in the modern world. Because who controls fuel increasingly influences who can maintain civilization itself during instability. Thus, the petrodollar and the fear of the financial containment. So most people think about oil as fuel for cars, factories, airplanes, and shipping fleets. But oil is also deeply connected to the financial system globally. The modern economy does not simply run on energy alone. It runs on the systems used to buy, transport, insure, finance, and settle that energy across international markets. And this is where the conversation becomes much larger than China itself. For decades, the global oil trade operated heavily through dollar-based systems. Major energy transactions were often settled in US dollars. International banking moved through Western-influenced financial networks. And global trade relied heavily on institutions connected to American economic power. This arrangement strengthened the United States in ways many ordinary people rarely notice. Countries around the world needed access to dollars in order to participate efficiently in global trade and energy markets. Well, international reserves accumulated in dollar-denominated assets, and American financial influence expanded alongside global commerce. So the larger the global economy became, the more central the dollar remained to the system itself. Well, China understood this structure very clearly, and Beijing also understands the risk that comes with depending too much on systems controlled by geopolitical rivals. Well, this concern intensified as the world watched sanctions and financial restrictions increasingly used as strategic tools, and nations could be disconnected from portions of the international banking system, and foreign reserves could be frozen, like in Russia. Access to global financial infrastructure could become restricted during geopolitical conflict. But for China, this created a serious long-term concern. What happens if the system needed to purchase and transport energy becomes politically weaponized during a future crisis? Well, the fear is not merely theoretical. China imports enormous quantities of oil every day. The industrial machine powering the nation depends on uninterrupted access not only to physical fuel, but also to the financial mechanisms required to secure that fuel. So tankers require insurance, transactions require settlement systems. Trade requires banking continuity. Industrial economies require confidence that global systems will continue functioning. And if financial pressure disrupted those systems during conflict, or even another COVID, China's energy security could be threatened without a single missile ever being launched. And this is one of the reasons Beijing became increasingly focused on reducing exposure to external financial pressure. Thus, the rise of BRICS comes in the discussions as yuan-based trade agreements, central bank diversification, gold accumulation, and alternative payment systems all connect back to the same underlying fear: dependence. China is not necessarily attempting to overthrow the dollar overnight, despite sensational headlines often claiming otherwise. The global financial system is far too large and interconnected for simple replacement narratives. But China clearly wants greater insulation from systems it cannot fully control, which makes sense. And this is their defensive strategy as much as an economic one. The larger China's industrial system became, the more vulnerable it became to interruption from multiple directions all at once. Oil imports could be disrupted physically through maritime conflict, and financial systems could be disrupted through sanctions or banking restrictions. Semiconductor access could be disrupted through export controls, and shipping could be disrupted through geopolitical escalation. Well, Chinese leadership increasingly sees all these vulnerabilities as interconnected. And this is why the modern struggle between major powers is no longer only military. It's infrastructural. Financial systems are infrastructure. Semiconductors, shipping lanes, energy corridors, data systems, all infrastructure. And whoever controls critical infrastructure gains enormous leverage during instability. Well, the public often hears phrases like economic warfare or trade war without fully grasping what those terms mean beneath the surface. Modern power increasingly operates through pressure on systems rather than traditional battlefield conquest alone. Restrict technology export, disrupt shipping access, sanction financial networks, freeze assets, pressure supply chains, and suddenly, entire economies begin feeling stress without conventional invasion. Well, China has spent years studying these realities. And Beijing's response has always been consistent. Build alternatives, create redundancy, diversify systems, and reduce vulnerability to external containment. So this is why China invested heavily in domestic technology development, and why Beijing expanded partnerships outside traditional Western structures, why China pursued alternative trade settlements, why gold reserves became increasingly important, why BRICS discussions gained momentum, why digital currency experiments accelerated, and why infrastructure and supply chain resilience became national priorities. Well, the issue is not simply ambition. It's fear of interruption, and I could agree with that. Modern industrial civilization requires constant flow to remain stable. Factories must keep operating. Trade must continue moving. Financial systems must continue settling transactions. And urban populations must continue receiving goods, energy, and employment opportunities. Once continuity breaks down for extended periods, political and social instability can follow quickly. China understands this deeply because its rise happened through rapid industrial acceleration on a scale rarely seen in history. And the machine cannot just simply stop. And it really reveals one of the most important truths about the modern world, that globalization created extraordinary wealth and technological advancement, but it also created civilizations dependent on systems stretching across oceans, banking networks, digital infrastructure, and resource corridors that they just don't fully control. So China's fear is not merely military defeat, it's systemic containment. And the fear of rivals, powers that could gradually tighten pressure around energy, finance, technology, and trade until the industrial machine itself begins losing stability from within. This is why the struggle for oil, currency systems, semiconductors, and infrastructure has become so intense in recent years. Because modern power is no longer measured only by armies. It's measured by who can keep systems functioning when pressure begins closing around them. So they were creating the Belt and Road Initiative because they knew that America was going to eventually start cutting back on allowing China to gain partnerships with other oil companies, allowing BRICS to gain in power. It's rivaling against the West. They don't want that anymore. Next comes the rare earths, the batteries, and the myth of the post-oil future. Now, for years, the public has been told that the world is moving beyond oil. Electric vehicles, renewable energy, battery systems, artificial intelligence, and digital infrastructure are often presented as the replacement for the old industrial economy. Many people now imagine a future where civilization becomes cleaner, lighter, and less dependent on physical resources. But the deeper the modern world moves into advanced technology, the more resource-intensive civilization actually becomes. The future is not becoming less physical, it's becoming more dependent on hidden industrial systems most people never see. Electric vehicles still requiring mining. We need to mine for that. Batteries require lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, graphite, and rare earth elements. Wind turbines require enormous quantities of steel, specialized metals, and industrial manufacturing, plastics. Solar infrastructure depends on global supply chains involving mining, transportation, refining, and fabrication. Artificial intelligence systems requires giant data centers consuming massive amounts of electricity. Semiconductor production requires ultra-complex manufacturing facilities operating through enormous energy consumption and highly specialized material. Even the digital the digital economy rests upon physical infrastructure stretching all across the planet. So this is one of the great contradictions of the modern age. The more virtual the world appears, the more hidden industrial systems are required beneath it. And China understood this reality earlier than many nations. So while much of the West focused heavily on software, finance, and service economies, China aggressively expanded control over portions of the physical supply chain, supporting the future technological economy. Beijing's invested heavily in rare earth processing, battery manufacturing, industrial refining, and mineral access, and large-scale production systems tied to green technologies and advanced electronics. Well, this gave China significant leverage across portions of the global supply chain. Rare earth elements became especially important because they are essential for many advanced technologies, including military systems, electronics, renewable energy infrastructure, magnets, telecommunication equipment, and electric vehicles. Despite the name, rare earths are not always extremely scarce geologically, but refining and processing the earth minerals, them at scale is very complex. and environmentally difficult and industrially demanding. It creates a lot of pollution. Well, China spent years building dominance in portions of this refinement process. And that matters enormously because nations dependent on advanced technology systems now rely on access to those industrial supply chains. Once again, the modern world discovered that technological power still depends on physical resource control beneath the surface. So this creates another paradox within globalization. Many Western economies outsourced portions of their industrial base because cheaper manufacturing reduced costs and increased efficiency. But over time, this also concentrated critical supply chains inside foreign systems vulnerable to geopolitical tensions. Now governments are rediscovering how dangerous dependency can become. Well, this conversation surrounding semiconductors, battery production, critical minerals, and industrial resilience, it's really about the same underlying issue shaping the oil discussion: continuity. Can modern nations sustain themselves during disruption? Can industrial systems continue operating if global fragmentation accelerates? Can advanced economies maintain technological infrastructure if access to critical materials becomes restricted? Well, China positioned itself aggressively within these industries because Beijing understands something many people still underestimate. Technology does not eliminate resource competition. Technology intensifies it. Artificial intelligence requires chips. Chips require fabrication plants. Fabrication plants require minerals, chemicals, electricity, and water. Electric vehicles require batteries. Batteries require extraction systems. And renewable infrastructure requires industrial manufacturing. Industrial manufacturing requires energy, and the machine still feeds on physical resources. And this is why the idea of a simple post-oil future is misleading. They're lying. They can't get away with it by 2030. And oil may eventually represent a smaller percentage of certain sectors, but the broader industrial system remains deeply tied to energy-intensive extraction through transportation, refining, manufacturing, and infrastructure. Even renewable systems depend heavily on fossil fuels during construction, mining, shipping, and deployment phases. So the world did not escape industrial civilization. It expanded industrial civilization into more technology through complex forms. China recognized this earlier than the competition anyway. And this is one of the reasons Beijing became heavily involved in African mining investments, South American resource agreements, strategic mineral access, and industrial processing capabilities tied to the next generation of technological infrastructure. So China understands that whoever controls key industrial inputs gains influence over the future economy itself. But this strategy also deepens China's own dependency problem. The more China dominates industrial production, the more resources China requires to sustain that production. And the more the digital economy expands globally, the greater the demand for energy, minerals, shipping, semiconductors, and industrial continuity becomes. So the machine grows larger, and the larger machines require larger flows of resource. And this is the hidden reality beneath the modern technological age as civilization appears increasingly digital on the surface, while becoming increasingly dependent on vast physical systems underneath. This is why oil still matters, why shipping lanes matter, why mining matters, why energy security matters. Because the cloud still sits on top of factories, cargo ships, pipelines, electrical grids, and industrial infrastructure spread across the earth. And China's rise reveals this contradiction more clearly than almost any nation on earth. But the future, it may look digital, but beneath the screen, the machine still runs on extraction, transportation, energy, and uninterrupted industrial flow. So even a war between America and China, there's just nobody wants a reset. The World Economic Forum, we're going to do a great reset. What are they trying to do? Reset banking? Well, the world's not ready to get off of oil yet. It's most certainly not ready to get rid of paper dollars. But it's easy to frame the modern world as a simple competition between the rising China and a declining America. Political rhetoric, media narratives, and online debates often reduce everything into opposing camps, where one nation must eventually defeat the other. But the deeper reality is far more complicated and way more dangerous. China just told Trump, At least Trump said that China said that they gave him a compliment about how he turned America, around within a year and a half. They gave him a compliment. But America became dependent on outsourced manufacturing, and both powers trapped themselves inside the same global system. That's why we can't have war. For decades, the United Nations shifted large portions of industrial production overseas in pursuit of efficiency, lower labor costs, higher corporate profits, and cheaper consumer goods. Factories closed across parts of America, while manufacturing expanded aggressively throughout Asia, especially China. And the arrangement appeared beneficial for many years as American consumers gained access to inexpensive products. Corporations increased margins, investors profited from globalization, and China gained industrial growth and export-driven expansion. But beneath the economic relationship, the structural dependency quietly formed. America gradually lost portions of its industrial self-sufficiency, and this dependency did not happen all at once. It emerged slowly across decades. Supply chains stretched farther across oceans, and pharmaceutical ingredients increasingly came from overseas producers. Electronics manufacturing concentrated heavily in Asia. Critical industrial components became dependent on foreign factories. Semiconductor producing became globally fragmented, and rare earth processing shifted abroad. Well, even strategic minerals tied to advanced technologies became increasingly dependent on international supply systems. And all this was on purpose because somebody wanted a new world order so that everyone could be dependent on each other, but it backfired. And now we're seeing what happens after that backfire. The modern economy rewarded low-cost production and just-in-time logistics. Warehouses shrank, inventory buffers disappeared, corporations optimized supply chains for speed and profit rather than resilience. Nations assumed global trade systems would remain stable indefinitely. Then disruptions began exposing how fragile the structure had actually become. Shipping delays triggered shortages. Manufacturing slowdowns affected industries worldwide. Semiconductor bottlenecks disrupted automobile production. There's a bunch of Fords waiting to be sold. Ford pickup trucks. Thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of them just sitting in a field waiting to be sold because they're waiting for a computer chip. And pharmaceutical concerns raised national security questions, and inflation surged as supply chains struggled under pressure. Suddenly, governments began realizing that overdependence on distant manufacturing carried risks far beyond economics alone. So this realization changed the geopolitical landscape dramatically. The United States began discussing reshoring industries, rebuilding semiconductor manufacturing, and strengthening domestic infrastructure in-house, securing supply chains and reducing dependency on strategic competitors. Critical technologies started being viewed as less as simple commercial sectors and more as national security infrastructure. And believe it or not, the tariffs, it forced small and medium-sized businesses to start because they didn't want to buy resources outside of America. It's just cheaper to now, because of the tariffs, to buy them inside America. So China was not the only nation worried about dependency anymore. America began rediscovering the dangers of relying too heavily on systems outside its direct control. And this is one of the reasons that tensions between Washington and Beijing intensified beyond traditional trade disputes. The conflict is no longer simply about tariffs or market competitions. It is increasingly about which nation can maintain industrial resilience during instability. Here lies the paradox. China depends heavily on foreign energy and export markets. America depends heavily on foreign manufacturing and industrial supply chains. Both powers became deeply entangled inside the same interconnected system, even while increasingly competing against one another. Well, this created a strange form of mutual vulnerability. A major disruption involving China could severely damage American industries dependent on Chinese manufacturing, and at the same time, severe disruption involving American markets or financial systems could heavily damage Chinese exports and economic growth. So for years, this interdependence acted like a stabilizing force because both sides understood the economic consequences of direct confrontation. Globalization tied nations together through trade, finance, technology, and logistics so deeply that large-scale disruption threatened everyone involved. But now fragmentation is growing. Nations across the world are reconsidering assumptions that shaped globalization for decades as governments are asking difficult questions about supply chain security, food resilience, semiconductor access, pharmaceutical independence, industrial capacity, rare earth processing, and energy continuity. The world is slowly shifting from maximum efficiency toward strategic resilience. And that transition carries enormous consequences. It means supply chains may become more regionalized. And I think this is a good thing. Manufacturing may partially relocate. Nations may prioritize redundancy over cost savings. And strategic industries may receive heavy government support. Trade blocs may increasingly form around security interests rather than pure market efficiency. Well, this is not the end of globalization entirely, but it may be the end of the assumption that globalization alone guarantees stability forever. Meaning, this has been a really good example of why globalization is bad. And the deeper issues that modern civilization became so interconnected that major powers can no longer isolate problems cleanly. So energy shortages in one region affect manufacturing in another, and the semiconductor disruptions affect global technology markets, and shipping instability affects inflation worldwide. Thus, sanctions affect commodity flows across continents, and financial systems ripple through every connected economy. So the machine became global. And now every major nation fears what happens if the machine begins fragmenting under pressure. So this is why America's dependency problem matters just as much as China's oil problem. Both reveal the same underlying truth. Modern civilization optimized itself for growth, efficiency, speed, and interconnection, but systems optimized only for efficiency often become fragile during instability because China fears interruption, because it cannot fully fuel itself. And America fears interruption. It does, because it cannot fully manufacture everything it depends upon anymore. So both powers are now racing to reduce vulnerability before larger disruptions emerge. And that race may define the next era of global politics more than ideology alone. Because beneath the speeches, elections, slogans, and headlines, all the lies, the same deeper struggle facing nearly every advanced nation is this: who can keep the system functioning when the flow begins breaking down? Well, that's the real oil trap. At first glance, the entire story appears to be about China, a rising superpower, imported oil, maritime choke points, Belt and Road Initiative, Taiwan tensions, supply chains, semiconductors, BRICS, global competition. But the deeper this examination goes, the more another truth begins to emerge. China is not the only nation trapped inside dependency. The real oil trap is the structure of modern civilization itself. For decades, the world built a global system based on uninterrupted flow. Energy would always move, shipping lanes would always remain open, financial systems would always settle transactions, factories would always operate, technology would always scale upward, globalization would continue integrating economies deeper together without major systemic breakdown. And entire generations of policymakers, corporations, and financial institutions all organized civilization around this assumption. Well, efficiency became the highest goal. Manufacturing concentrated where labor was cheapest and energy flowed through the most profitable routes. Well, where does that leave us? Well, the public often imagines the digital age as something detached from physical reality. People speak about the cloud as though information floats independently somewhere beyond material systems. But the cloud sits inside data centers consuming enormous electricity. Artificial intelligence runs on chips requiring global manufacturing infrastructure. Semiconductors depend on rare earth minerals, fabrication plants, water systems, chemicals, transportation, and stable power grids. Look, the more advanced civilization becomes technologically, the more hidden infrastructure it requires beneath the surface. Always. Oil still moves cargo. Natural gas still powers industries. Coal still supports electrical grids. And nuclear systems still require industrial maintenance, as renewables still require mining, transportation, and heavy manufacturing. We're getting worse, not getting any better. Dependence on uninterrupted global continued self is what matters. between even America and China, as every major power now understands something fundamental, that modern civilization is far more fragile than it appears. I mean, who can keep electricity flowing? Who can maintain manufacturing? Who can secure shipping lanes? Who can protect energy infrastructure? Who can maintain food distribution? Who can sustain industrial production when global systems weaken? Well, these questions are becoming central to modern geopolitics, and this is why China's oil dependency matters so much. It reveals the hidden architecture beneath both modern worlds. China's rise reshaped the modern world more rapidly than almost any economic transformation in human history. In only a few decades, the country evolved from widespread poverty into the industrial center of global manufacturing. That's an achievement. Entire cities emerged, infrastructure expanded at astonishing speed, and factories multiplied endlessly as ports connected continents. Technology industries accelerated, hundreds of millions entered industrial society within a single generation. To much of the world, China appeared unstoppable. But beneath the hidden dependency, was changing the structure of the global power itself, as China built a machine larger than the fuel beneath its own soil. The modern world built itself around uninterrupted flow. And China depends heavily on imported energy. And this is why they're going to do a deal with Trump. I don't know when, probably soon, between now and the next 100 years, because they're running out of oil. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden inside China's oil trap. The world believed technology would free civilization from dependency. Hell no, it made it worse. Instead, civilization became more interconnected, more industrial, more resource intensive, and more vulnerable than ever before. Thus, the modern world may appear digital on the surface, but beneath the screen, folks, the machine still runs on fuel.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books on the breath war, the crown of blood, and the ritual machine. Fix your body by buying his award-winning detox formula, removing heavy metals and parasites. You'll feel better and live longer. Go to elitepotion.com. And one more thing, please. Just try and love your neighbor, because if you do, the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.